Um, both Reed and Yanni spoke of the frame um, that contains consistency and continuity and safety for our patients. But the frame must break. It will break because of death, because the analyst or the therapist has moved away, because the patient or analysand has outgrown it, like a chick outgrows the shell of the egg, like the butterfly outgrows the cocoon. It's an organic, natural process. So ultimately, I'm going to ask a question. If goodbyes are inevitable in this fragile life, wouldn't therapy be a most fruitful place to practice them? And is that not an argument for terminating analysis when it is appropriate? Some mention has been made this morning about analyses that of our own or of our patients that have gone on for many years. Some comment has been made about the analyst should always be available to the analysand. And I'm just wondering if that might be in denial of an opportunity to help our patients prepare for the inevitable goodbyes, which is the subject of this conference.
I think that is an excellent question, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts about it. Dr. Spotnitz in his said that the final resistance is the resistance to termination.
Yes.
And Phyllis Meadow said in a discussion on ending group, she said, therapy should not replace life. If the patient is replacing therapy with life, you're doing something wrong.
Yes.
But at the same time, they also said, if we get started, my original dissertation topic was on termination, so I've got a lot I could say about this. But they also say patients need to know that they can come as long as they want. So right. And they say that, vacations and, time away is a time to practice for termination. So, yeah, I don't know. I think, I think it's an organic process, and that how does one know that? How do you find out that you can come or go, that you can take it or leave it?
Yeah.
That's
when Dr. Spotnitz is talking about resistance, is he speaking about the therapist's resistance or the patient's resistance, or both?
I don't see why it can't be both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think books are, on the treatment of schizophrenic patients, and but I think it could be, I think it could be both. We have a number of Spotnitz experts around here. We can see if they'll weigh in. I believe Phyllis Beck even knew the man. Actually, many people here knew the man himself. So
that was
so feel free to.
That was about the best argument for termination I've heard so far. But I'm thinking how there always must be an other for the other, and I think that goes for the patient as well as for the analyst. So hence, when the door shuts on, even if it's only on a session, there's music afterwards or whatever.
So terminations is something I wouldn't quite say desirable, but something that one should not avoid, and especially as he was talking about when terminations, like when somebody, and that was some decades ago, but when somebody moves to another town, place, that you let them go, that they can have a new experience, they can have an experience with another analyst, and that could be beneficial. And she also had mentioned that was kind of from a personal communication, that disappointment is always part of the end of an analysis, some form of non-completion, that all that one went to resolve or accomplish hasn't happened and never will. And she actually mentioned that about her own analysis with Spotnitz, and something that Spotnitz himself had mentioned about his own analysis. So I don't know if these are final or definitive words by any means, but it really, it's multifaceted, and one can keep those things in mind as we work through our own way of doing things.
I forget sometimes that endings are often the way to open the opportunity for new experiences. I was at the Vermont School when it closed as well, and I was as angry and grieved as much as anybody else. But at this point in my training and my life, I am really glad I had the opportunity to then go to Boston, because I trained with people that were not teaching in Vermont. I met students that were not ever going to come to Vermont, and it helped me to grow and appreciate the experiences there that contributed to my personal growth and to my training. But you couldn't have told me that on the day that they came to announce that the school would be closing.
Still a painful day for me, Bonnie, even though
Yeah.
you know, we all survived in one way. I was connected to the New York center as well. So, but to this day, it hurts.
Yes,
It
it
hurts.
does.
Even if it was good in some other ways, it's
Mhm.
still really, yeah. A loss is a loss and cannot be replaced, but by something else that is good necessarily.
That's true.
So this discussion reminds me of a conference I went to, and David, you might remember his name. His first name was Jeffrey, and he was from Colorado, and he was the person who wrote. He wrote a comparison between the outcomes of psychoanalysis and other psychotherapies. And what he said to me was really very significant, and which has proven in my own experience, and that was that when you've ended or terminated your therapy as in psychoanalysis, it doesn't end. What you've learned continues even without having an analyst. And that was the very unusual finding when compared to other therapies that did not happen.
That's significant.
I am Mark Solms called it the sleeper effect, and I don't know if that's the official name of it, you know, in the research, but I remember him talking about that.
Mhm.
Harry Guntrup, in his experience with Fairburn and Winnicott as analysts, had that happen to him after he finished the analysis with both those analysts. That very thing.
And Jonathan Shedler writes about this as well.
That's it. You
That's
got
it, Shadler.
name. It's not Jeffrey, it's Jonathan. That's it.
Oh, okay.
I had a supervisor for about 8 years, and he was kind of an iconoclast. And so he got me through a couple of terminations. One was a man who had been attending the treatment service in Boston. And he had then, he had taken a job in Western Massachusetts. And I said to my supervisor, should I address this? And he said, not until the patient does. And so the patient was relentlessly talking about the new job, and he'd be moving there, and it starts on this day. And so he would say stuff like, well, it won't be long now, that kind of thing. And I just relentlessly did not comment. And finally, on the last day, he said, well, this is our last session. And I said, does it have to be? And he said, well, I suppose I could call you. I said, yeah, you're right. You could do that. Okay, I'll do that. And that was the entire conversation. So, so my supervisor's advice was really good. Don't bring it up until this patient brings it up, and then question it. Just ask questions. The other thing, same supervisor, I had a number of people that were thinking about termination, and I said, I really don't feel that that's a good idea. He said, none of your business whether it's a good idea. It's their life. Make it easy to go. Tell them, great, we need, if you're ready to terminate, that's fine. I think a lot of thought went into this, even if it hadn't. And and then I would just remark, door's always open, see ya. And they would leave. And in probably 4 or 5 different terminations, they come back. New issue, new problem, new boyfriend, new whatever. And we start up again. He said, the easier you make it to leave, the less resistance you'll find in them coming back to check in with you. I found both of those pieces of advice to be excellent.
Hey, Lynn, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a regular part of my practice. And I kind of feel in my practice environment like it's the only way to do it, because there's so much, I mean, there's not much subject supposed to know about working analytically in this environment. And I've just found that to work really well, to be really facilitated, but I always feel like I'm transgressing when I do that, that I'm committing some kind of analytic transgression.
So it's the top of the hour, and we've got a couple of presentations. And Bonnie, I think that Vic is up first. These are both Vic and Justin are longtime students at the Colorado Center.
And they both happen to be from Montana.
Well, I don't know if any white people are from Montana, not from very far back, but anyway.
Well, you practice there, we'll say it that way.
John Schultz is from Montana. John Schultz is here.
Oh, wow. Hi.
So Victor Stampley has been in clinical practice in Western Montana since 1984. He first focused on work with adolescents, pre-adolescents, and families. He began taking classes at CCMPS in the mid-90s, and in the late 1990s began weekly supervision with Jan Middeldorf. They worked together for approximately 20 years. Mr. Stampley commented that much of his practice has been with a conservative population that could be considered non-psychologically oriented. This was especially true when he worked as a therapist and clinical supervisor at a rural mental health center in the mountainous westernmost county of Montana. There was a sizable group of military veterans who suffer from PTSD who lived there. When they could find no other way to cope with the effects of trauma, many of them would show up at the mental health center, although with some ambivalence. Mr. Stampley's military upbringing and rural lifestyle created an affinity for working with these patients. He will discuss the ways in which the combination of psychoanalytic theory as conceived by Jacques Lacan and the neuroscientific ideas of Jaak Panksepp benefited his practice and ultimately the population of military veterans he served.
First of all, I'm not a real Lacanian. Joe Scalia is a real Lacanian, and if he shows up back here, it'll be the second time this year. He's been my worst nightmare at a presentation about having anything Lacanian. So I welcome his return, but I welcome it with a bit of dread. So my Lacan, like my Jesus, is pretty idiosyncratic and subject to interpretation. And it is very much beyond Lacan. That said, I find it to have opened up clinical conceptions immeasurably. As Jan once put it, the idea that that Lacan, who was the pet of the Parisian intelligentsia in the post-war era, would find a place in Superior, Montana, a euphemistic name for a town, is kind of a testament to modern psychoanalysis's portability and applicability, its capacity for morphing. And I don't think anybody, well, I can't imagine anybody morphing it more than Jan did. So I'm just gonna go over Jan Lacan, and because it's what I found particularly clinically efficacious. If Joe shows up, he can correct me on some things, but I'm sticking by my version in terms of clinical efficacy. Basically, the thing that I found most helpful in working with this population was the idea of Lacan's 3 registers of human functioning. And if you can conceive of those as circles with an overlapping sweet spot in the middle where all 3 circles overlap in balance to the same extent, each circle overlapping to the same extent. Sometimes I thought that was Jan's idea of the sweet spot of human integration. And these 3 realms of human functioning are what Lacan called the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. It's easy to privilege one over the other, and when we do so, whether we do it out of enthusiasm or whether we do it out of defensiveness or some combination of the two, we do it at the expense of integration, at the expense of balance. The real is the realm that we share with all other living creatures. It is unfiltered. Jan liked to differentiate that from quote unquote reality, reality being a culturally determined concept, really. And the real is anything but a concept. The real is non-conceptual. The real is unfiltered by the prefrontal cortex's capacity and a tendency, insistence upon naming, upon having some kind of a language to name phenomena with. And that naming filters out the realness of the phenomena. It resonates in that way with Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception. And Jan also liked to cite that psychedelic experience may be one of the few ways other than trauma in which human beings can access this level of unfiltered real. But it's always problematic given the animal that we have evolved into, an animal that depends upon its prefrontal cortex to conceptualize about the environment that we find ourselves in. I'm going to leave it there for the real for now, but just suffice it to say, it is beyond words. It can't be conceptualized. It can't be named. It's the burning bush. Whether for good or for ill, and there's the rub, because it's whether it's psychedelic experience, spiritual experience, or trauma, it's beyond good and evil. It's beyond good and bad. The imaginary realm is that realm that the human being is ushered into in what Lacan called the mirror stage, in which the child perceives their reflection in the mirror, and that is a non-real experience. That's an abstract experience. And so selfhood is based in abstraction. Ego is based in abstraction. Ego, as is said in Buddhist psychology, is illusory or a delusion. But it is a really important one in order to make one's way through the world of human social environment, certainly. So the imaginary is, the word image is the foundation of Lacan's use of the term imaginary. It involves lots of other flights of fancy, but they all come back to this necessarily delusionary view of a self, of a selfhood. The third realm is the symbolic. That is also an unreal realm. We can say the imaginary and the symbolic are non-real realms. Jan also pointed out regularly that the imaginary is a realm that's shared with a lot of other animals too. The real is shared with all creatures, with all creation. But the imaginary is shared with a lot of other animals. And it is that insistence upon a kind of a reductionistic identity in order to, in human beings, to define the individual ego. But as Jan liked to point out, in other animals, like he used this example of red ants and black ants. Red ants always know they're red ants, and they know that black ants ain't black ants, and that there's something akin to human racism that is afoot in that. So it's not as in the real as the real is, but it's shared with other creatures. In the symbolic is the realm of the realm where is the capacity for elaborated thought, so that any phenomenon in the imaginary can be conceived of and reflected upon in in the symbolic realm. The symbolic realm is the realm of the dialectic, and the dialectic can go on forever. So an example, I can't remember whether, Jan conveyed this directly to me or if it was kind of like a co-thought concept, but I like to use the example of, if any of y'all remember the period of time of the early 70s where Bob Dylan discovered Jesus. Seems pretty clear upon reflection. Here was somebody who had a little too much real. There was lots of overexposure to the real in the form of psychedelics during that period of time. And here was Bob Dylan, of all people, finding solace in Christianity. I think Bob Dylan obviously is a creature who has immense capacity in the symbolic realm. So I have no doubt Bob Dylan worked his way out of that in a pretty healthy way, and probably in an integrative way. But there were a lot of people around that time who didn't. And they donned the mantle of Christianity, born-again Christianity, in a manner that gave them a sense of ego coherence. But it did so in a manner that we're still dealing with the legacy of today, I think. And it did so in a manner that was exclusionary. But somebody mentioned the exclusionary aspect of religion earlier today. By nature, at least an approach to religion that is not interpreted by the symbolic, by symbolization, by a dialectic, will fall prey to getting stuck in the imaginary. And this stuckness in the imaginary has a lot in common with Klein's concept of the paranoid schizoid, in which the imaginary ego, the image, the imago of the self is so flimsy, or I mean, not that it isn't, it always is, but there's something that requires such overcompensation that paranoid schizoid borderline strategies are required in order to shore it up. And hence I'm the chosen one and you're not, and so you must die. That's a problem, a social problem that arises from a stuckness, an overprivileging of the imaginary. I happen to believe that, just to use religion for an example, that religion is an institution that can be interpreted through the symbolic, through endless dialectic, and as such, it does not have to be stuck in the imaginary. It does not have to be stuck in paranoid schizoid exclusionary sadism. I'm going to leave it there for now with that example of Jan Lacan, and get to Jacques Panksepp's neuroscientific concepts. Panksepp took Freud's two-drive theory and expanded it in an interspecies manner. He found that this was true of all primates, that there are 7 drive circuits, not just 2 drive circuits, and they don't necessarily, they actually don't coincide with Freud's 2-drive circuit model. Panksepp's 7 drive circuits were the seeking circuit, the rage circuit, the fear circuit, the lust circuit, the care circuit, the play circuit, and the panic/grief circuit, which seems the panic and grief may seem like odd bedfellows, but I think with the subject matter that we're talking about today, we can probably relate to the way that grief elicits panic at the idea of loss, at the experience of loss. I've found it really helpful to wonder after what circuit or what combination of circuits is or are firing off in either a particular transference countertransference moment or a moment that a patient is describing that may involve transferences with another person or not. In the environment that I was working in this particularly conservative, particularly retrograde part of Montana, trauma was ubiquitous. It wasn't only there was a higher than average proportion of veterans. I mostly worked with Vietnam veterans who I mean, in terms of veterans who had hidden out in the hills and were kind of counting up their ammo and taking solace in that, and their version of boundaries was to have some kind of a compound well defended with firepower. But trauma is ubiquitous in that culture. It's not coincidental that also a much higher than average percentage of young males from areas like that volunteer for the military and in the military volunteer for particularly traumatizing assignments. So there was that. There would seem to be a huge incidence of sexual abuse in the local culture, including incest. Lots of repetition compulsion at work in terms of behaviors that were highly risk-taking and highly destructive to the self and other. And in the imaginary realm, the need to repeat these things as a way of finding one's identity, especially as males. So when I look at cultures like that, and when I look in a larger sense at what is going on in American society these days, I've found it very helpful to wonder after to what extent are these manifestations, these behaviors, something driven by the real, something actually manifesting from the drives. Lacan would see the drives as being in the real of the body. The drives are real. To what extent are they imaginary? For instance, in the sense of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a young man, what it means to be from my family, what it means to be from my particular neck of the woods. And I saw precious little of the symbolic. I think maybe the most graphic example of that was a fairly young man who came to see me, who could not, he was alexithymic. That's another salient word here, alexithymia, the absence of words, notably the absence of words to describe internal phenomena. This guy couldn't describe anything going on inside of himself. And I was thinking the mental health center had, these old, like feeling charts with the faces on them on the wall. And I had long since, saw that as really some pathetic approach to counseling. But damned if I didn't start thinking, there's some wisdom to that. It's when a person cannot literally describe any internal phenomena, they need some forum in which to come up with words for the real, to the extent as is possible, for the drives. And Lacan likes to say it's impossible to really find words for the real, but especially to find words for the way that we've over relied upon the imaginary to try to contend with the real. Whether it's some capacity in ourselves to say, well, I've tried to contend with this by being, or what I think a man should be, or I've tried to contend with this by being what I think a Christian should be, or whatever, fill in the blank of what the imaginary construct of what one should be. But I found that to be a really good, not that this guy in particular ever got to anything near that extent, but he did get to the point where he could make it through a session and talk about like something at the cusp of the real, like a bodily sensation, or that gray zone that I think of what an affect is, where a bodily sensation is translatable into emotion, which may then be translatable into something else, something that's not just raw emotion, something that is reflective upon the emotion. Jan's way of teaching, I think of Jan's way of teaching as being more relational. It was a relational phenomenon, and I've said all I need to say right now, and I'm interested in anything that may pique anything in people, and ways people may help me understand this stuff.
Oh, if there is an inflation in one of those three realms, in a way in violation of what you said in the beginning of the ideal of balance of the integration in the sweet spot. So if there's the inflation, as there was with this young man, in the realm of the imaginary,
Mm-hmm.
the role of the therapist to help balance those three realms out in some way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do see that as being the case, and in fact, I think you're really perceptive that his lockup was in the imaginary, because a man doesn't talk about these things, right? I mean, I think that was, and to be a part of his family growing up meant to not talk about we don't talk in this family. We do. We're a culture of action. We're not just talk. And I think that idea gets distilled. Yeah. So, and that's actually where Jan's ideas of melding modern analysis to these other conceptions was really helpful. And paramount among that was, and I think any of us who were in analysis with Jan really appreciated this about Jan, the permission to to kind of prime the pump with object-oriented discussion and to avoid ego-oriented interpretations. When Joe Scalia was here last night, he pointed out the difference between psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And I've come to believe there's a difference. I think Jan characterized that as deconstructive versus reconstructive approaches. And Jan would have seen what Joe was characterizing as Lacanian psychoanalysis as deconstructive. And what was at issue in this practice environment I'm describing is totally reconstructive, or just constructive in the first place, constructing a capacity for symbolization. But joining and mirroring and object-oriented discussion are absolutely intrinsic to being able to do that. And there's a definite affective quality in the transference field to this, in which there is kind of a warm maternal feeling that can be experienced with patients like this, where we're talking about things that, have obviously are not about warm maternal or homosexual panic-inducing subject matter. Like, for instance, what a particular guy likes about a particular caliber of guns, or whatever. Justin, I don't know if that's touches on at all what you're going to talk about, but it certainly touches on your experience with veterans a lot, I know. So yeah, that's a good point.
If I may follow up, okay, if I may.
Yeah.
What you said underscores to me the appeal of ideology, whether it is political or religious, to someone who is sort of lost in the realm of the imaginary, which perhaps can be considered, maybe, I don't know enough about this, but maybe a realm of doubt. And if someone resides there in that inflation of the imaginary, the appeal of certainty is very seductive.
Right. And I wouldn't characterize in my way of seeing it, I wouldn't characterize the imaginary as a realm of doubt. If anything, I would see it as an overcompensated certainty. Okay. But obviously that's underlain by an incapacity to tolerate doubt.
Okay, thank you.
Vic, I was wondering with that lexithymia, I used to use those little feeling faces with kids, including teens. And so with the kids, the lexithymia was somewhat related to a lack of development. Do you think that these guys that you're working with, there's a lack of development, or are they developed and then regressed, maybe because of their Vietnam experience?
That's a really good point too. I've got a pet theory that I'm sticking to. I'm sure there's lots of arguments to the contrary, but I have real doubts about adult onset PTSD without precursors, without developmental precursors. Mm-hmm. And Bob, I'm seeing you nod. I know you have a lot of experience with this subject matter. So, and I was a little scared to say that in your presence, Bob, because with your experience of it, I was like, "Whoa, what is this?" I certainly don't think the Veterans Administration or anybody who specializes in standard issue and GI PTSD treatment is gonna like that idea. And there are political reasons in the development of the concept of PTSD, both both through feminism and through the veterans movement. There are political reasons why this is not considered, why the idea of developmental trauma as a precursor to really really severe PTSD. There are political reasons why they don't like to look at that kind of thing. And I really understand why they wouldn't want to. But the result is that this huge blind spot in treatment and the possibility for iatrogenic damage because of that.
Mhm.
I would add there's also a lot of economic reasons to
Mhm.
not look at that, especially when it comes to veterans with disabilities and the disability that they receive because of their injuries.
Right.
And look at a car accident or something like that, and how the lengths an insurance company will go to deny a compensation to somebody they saying that something existed ahead of time. And so
Right. And I'm, this gets into wider societal implications for me, because I think this is what a society and a government should consider before they go to war. You're going to get people driven by a repetition compulsion to put themselves in harm's way. And as one veteran that I worked with more than any others said, and he was like the cream of the crop, and he always volunteered for the most dangerous work. And he said, I kept cranking the wing nuts down and down and down and down until one day they just went, and he was astounded that it happened to him, because he could take it and take it and take it. But he also, I see him as having very much an alexithymic introduction into the world through his family.
I wanted to comment briefly on what Dean had said. The therapist helping the patient to balance these three realms of experience, the real, the imaginary, and symbolic. While Jan, of course, in his silence, encouraged the patient to keep talking and to keep putting words to their experience, Vic said this happens through symbolization. I wanted to emphasize that the way in which those three realms become balanced is through symbolization, whether it be the picture of a sad face, which acts as a symbol, or something that the analyst says. But Jan was occasionally intervening by providing a word to the patient. And he commented on this several times, the power, and I know that he must have been so careful, so careful. Who knows how long he was thinking about just the right word. But sometimes introducing a new word or somewhat unfamiliar word, a word that wasn't part of the person's regular lexicon, and how that word could often capture the realness of that experience. There's so much of what's happening in the body as a response, the nervous system, to talking about this experience. And suddenly the patient runs into a wall where it's very ineffable. They're running into the real. And Jan found a way that, much like Beth and Amy had said earlier, he had this knack, this incredible natural talent, it seems, to find just the right word to give the patient that would seem, at least in the moment, to capture the realness of that experience.
Yeah, there was a real resonance in he was really attuned in the transference field to what he was symbolizing.
Last questions?
Oh, look at that, Jack.
I think is that Judith? Okay, Thank you. Vic, anything else? Anything else? Any last word? We got Justin up on deck.
That's fine.
I had a quick question for Vic.
Oh, great.
Right at the end of your, when you were talking there, you were introducing the real, symbolic, the imaginary, and concept, and then you said about how Jan approached learning from a relational style, which of course he was amazing at. Do you see any? Is there some sort of assimilation between the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary, along with that related learning approach?
That's a great meta question. Oh. Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's what made learning with Jan so rich, is that there was an affective component, in the real of the body. And certainly a pleasure in symbolizing, which is then experienced in the real of the body, neurologically, and certainly an imaginary thing, like I mean, attainment in learning is to find oneself understanding and contributing to ongoing understanding is that's a real beneficial imaginary experience.
I did have one more question. Is the sweet spot at all similar to the syntome? I don't know that word. That's new to me today.
No, I don't think so. What the term for the sweet spot is the Borromean knot, in which, well, it's the balance and the intersected balance, the overlap.
Adam is showing it.
Oh yeah. There we go. The syntome. I do want to say just one other thing about the syntome, because I've got it on my vanity license plate. It means a lot to me. Syntome, it's not coincidence that it sounds like symptom, and it is an invented word by Lacan. And my understanding from Jan about what comprises a syntome is that which would otherwise be clearly a symptom, only it takes a form in which it is potentially, at least potentially, very beneficial to self and society. You'll like this, John. Jan's the example Jan used to like to use was, and I don't know if Jan, Helene, was Jan familiar with Jimi Hendrix's music at all?
Yes.
Oh, was he? Okay.
Yeah.
I always wondered, but he loved to use that example of, apparently, despite Jimi Hendrix's musical and sexual prowess, he was a very shy man. And he would go to parties and according to this story Jan used to tell, and he would hole up in a corner as the party swirled around him. He would have his electric guitar unplugged, and he would just spend the whole time, including when people were coming up and coming on to him or whatever, he would be playing his guitar, practicing scales, whatever. And that was what Jan, that's how Jan liked to kind of epitomize a syntome. And now I also want to add that one of the things that I never felt resolved about with Jan, kind of a difference of opinion or a difference of wondering about things, was Jan didn't buy Michael Eigen's concept of a psychotic core. But Jan did not pathologize syntome, and I think he saw it as a positive thing. And I wonder, without a psychotic core, why would we need a syntome? A syntome is supposed to hold us together so we don't psychotically fragment. And so I just wonder about that. But we all hopefully have things, you know, including psychoanalysis, to be a synthome for us, hold us together. The similarity, John, is that there's a knotting involved, like the Borromean knot. You know, so maybe you're onto something there.
Knotting, K-N-O-T-T-I-N-G.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
So Vic, I just for clarification, are you saying that Jan never said that there was not any relationship in a person to a psychosis or psychotic connection? Are you saying that it did not exist at all?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, I'm familiar when you say psychotic core. What you mean by psychotic core? Do you mean that there is no connection, that we all have, that many of us do not have any connection inside our development to a psychotic part of ourselves?
Jan seems to have had this idea that with good enough mothering and good enough upbringing, no person has to carry with them what Eigen calls a psychotic core into later stages of development. And my response to that was like, okay, Jan, I mean, if that's the kind of upbringing you had, but all I have to do is look in the mirror to see a psychotic core there. I just never felt like that was resolved. But in practice with Jan, I mean, Jan was always so this attunement that we're discussing here and that Adam brought up of you know, the ability to tune in countertransferentially. He would in that attunement, he always seemed to know when we were dealing with a psychotic space in one's personality structure. And that to me inheres that, and Jan did say that, I don't know if he said it in so many words, but he definitely conveyed that with any patient, no matter how developed, there are going to be times when a purely modern analytic approach is in order, joining and mirroring and that sort of support for those shaky aspects of our ego structure. So, you know, those are some of the things I wish Jan had stuck around for me to argue with him more about anyway, you know, and wonder about. And
Thank you, Vic. Thank you very much. I think Mr. Klein, I think you're up if you're ready. Bonnie?
Yes, I'd like to I suspect you all know Justin, but maybe there are some things that he passed along to me that you'll learn about him.
Mm-hmm.
He is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice in Missoula, Montana. And he's been training in psychoanalysis at CCMPS since 2009. He has worked in a variety of settings, including residential adolescent treatment, community organizing, trauma treatment with combat veterans through the Veterans Administration. And that explains why he has so much knowledge that he was sharing about veterans. Adjunct work with the University of Montana, in addition to his private practice. He has a special interest in practicing psychoanalysis in rural areas such as Montana, and he welcomes the challenges that those settings bring. His other interests include a love of the outdoors, where he can be found most any day when he's not working, and sometimes he even attends classes outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
His topic today encompasses the meaning of the Lacanian concept of lack and how it relates to the narcissistic transference. He will include personal experience, clinical work, and scientific research to illustrate the concepts he discusses.
Or I'll try anyways. So first, I just wanted to introduce why I'm talking about this. And that was because when Reed was helping to organize this conference, he asked some students if anyone would be willing to say something. And I thought, well, I could say something. I don't know what, but sure. And I wanted to talk about lack because it was something that seemed both very pertinent, something that I remember recently that we were discussing in a course. Funny, actually, we were discussing this concept in a course actually, and I was calling in, and I was actually in the middle of a 2-week-long bow hunting trip, and I was in a field in class. I remember talking about lack as we were out there, and so I wanted to talk about this, and not because I feel like I am an expert on this at all, or any way, shape, or form. But it also in part as a testament to some of these things that I got from Jan over the years, which was it was to follow my drives. First of all, I think he was one of the greatest examples of somebody who just did what they thought was interesting, sort of made their life work because of that, and I thought that to be really, really amazing. And I don't know if we have time for this, but at some point, Helene, I would love to hear how he got that kind of such an attitude where he was able to simply do that for himself. It was really, really quite remarkable. And one of the things that I loved in how he did this was kind of with what Vic was talking about is how comfortable Jan would be with learning about things and creating theory. And one of the things I always loved about CCMPS was I always had the sense that we were developing ideas together, that we were looking and talking about different ideas, different clinical ways to approach something, and developing these concepts together using, Lacan or Klein or whomever, and then building on those ideas to help us in our practices. So it's with that kind of a spirit in mind that I thought, well, I'll talk about lack because it's clinically relevant, and certainly with his passing, something that is very present. And it was something that was very personal for me as well. I would have easily have loved to spend the next, you said Jan wanted to live to be 95. I would have loved to have spent the next 20 or so more years being in class, doing what I was just describing, what we had always done, listening, asking questions. I mean, Jan was like, everybody who knows him knows he was like an encyclopedia. But he had this really, really wonderful way of, even though he was this sort of walking encyclopedia understanding of psychoanalysis, that we were still, I still felt like I was involved in the creation of ideas. And I realized he did that with, and like what you all were also describing here a little bit ago, how did he know when to say something, when not to say something, that sort of thing. And I think it comes down to this sense of lack. And again, please, and I'm going to come at this with a wild embracing of my own sense of lack. So I regularly invite anybody who has any thoughts on this to please help fill in the gaps, because I'm bringing lots of lack to the table as in my conversations about this. So my very, very brief understanding of the Lacanian idea of lack is that when we are bored, we come into this world as babies, and we have a lot of needs that need to be attended to from our caregivers. And the best of caregivers, you know, as Winnicott puts it, you know, it's the good enough parenting. And so the part of this good enough parenting, it also implies an imperative that there is a certain amount of lack involved in that parenting. Meaning, we cry, we need attending to because we're hungry, or because we need a diaper change, or we just want some company, or we're cold, or this, that, or the other. And so mom and dad attend to our needs during all this process. And then, of course, this is the mirror phase that Vic was talking about. And we really begin to learn our sense of identity and development because it's being reflected back to us by our caregivers. You know, we need a diaper change, and the parents go, "Oh, I know, honey, you're uncomfortable. We'll get your diaper changed, blah, blah, blah." So we're being mirrored and told what's going on. And it's creating, it helps us to create a certain amount of ego, a sense of self, which gets embedded in all of this. And then, as everyone probably already knows intuitively, you know, when kids start getting a little bit older and they start fussing, and they want this or that or the other, and parts, it's, you know, it's just, as a parent, you know, it's just like, oh my God, just tell me what you want. I'm not going to read your goddamn mind all the time. And so we say to our kid, honey, you need to use your words. What is the problem here? And it introduces a certain amount of this notion of lack, where the child begins to realize that mommy and daddy aren't everything, that there are certain amounts of agency that exist within the child, that they can have some effect on the outside world around them. And while this is really challenging, anyone who's been around a 2 or 3 year old who's going through this, it can be a little frustrating. You can tell it can be very frustrating for the child as well. But it's so important because it gives such a sense of efficacy to the individual. So they learn how to interact with the world. They learn how to use symbolization to obtain what they need and want for themselves in the world. And so that's what I would imagine it could look like ideally, right? There has to be a certain amount of lack because it enables a child to figure out how to get for themselves. Now, of course, it's easy to imagine this with too much lack. It would be too overstimulating for a child. So, to leave a baby or, a little child who can't really figure out what to say or how to say it, and just sort of stand there, say, well, until you tell me what's wrong, you can just scream your fucking head off. I mean, that's not doing anybody any favors. It's too much. So my immediate experience after Jan died was this sort of very bittersweet kind of moments. I mean, like I said, as much as I would have loved to, continue the direction of CCMPS and his leadership, to be in classes and to be around him, I really had this strong sense that it was going to be okay, that I was going to be okay, that I had a certain amount of lack that was now extra palpable because of him not being there. But at the same time, it was just like, well, okay, it's kind of like, it's like drinking breast milk. It was like, okay, I guess I don't need to keep being breastfed. I guess I can go out and buy some books. I don't learn very well from reading. It's sort of not my learning style. I learned, this is another reason I love CCMPS, is I learn so well from talking and interacting with people. I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna have to get some fucking books and, you know, start chewing a little bit. I gotta start figuring some of these other things out. Or, you know, and I'm realizing, you know, I'm at the very end of my training with CCMPS before I get certified. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess I will become certified and, you know, do other things other than just sit in class and talk about theory and ideas. And so this notion of lack, it can be very, very challenging to us. But I mean, I think even structurally speaking, Helene, especially from the amount of work that has been, you know, accelerated because of his passing, we can see how this lack is creating other structures and helping us to become, you know, a community that's more organized, that's having to do some things differently, having to adjust, having to, you know, chew our own foods for some of us, more so than we have before. And it's challenging because I think earlier in the day, there was some talk about, you know, feeling unquilted that Linda brought up. And I think sometimes that lack can become, at least temporarily, it can feel a little too overwhelming. And so that's my thoughts. That was when asked, you know, if we wanted to say anything, that was what I wanted to just address and talk about, you know, in terms of lack, how it can be too much and how it can be just right. And Jan was so good at making it just right. Yeah, it's too bad that he had to pass when he did. That might be the one time he didn't quite get it right.
Yeah. Right.
Justin, I wanted to ask you if you've gone out and bought some books.
I have.
Have you? Oh, now you have to tell.
I always buy books, but I don't read them all. I only read like half of them or so.
But you have to tell us which book you bought.
Jesus! I bought a bunch of books. I bought that Claudia Heilbaum. Heilbrin. That was quite good. And another one, one that a friend of mine who's a writer here in town suggested to me, called Your Voice in My Head. And it's a memoir about a woman who had a very difficult time, and her analyst died, and she was in a love affair with Colin Firth or something like that. And he kind of rejected her, and it was her experience of grieving and having this person in her head. Anyway, it's another tangential, but
Justin, I have a question that may be it may be off the wall. I'm not clear because I don't know Lacan as well as you clearly do. But I'm wondering if there's a relationship between lack and the mirror phase of when a child discovers themselves. And I ask it because I have a patient who is electively mute. And there was a period of time when we had to meet this way during the pandemic. And there was a day when she put her face very close to the monitor and she looked me in the eye and she studied my face, and I could feel something pass between us. And the next session after that, she began to talk about what her childhood was like, how it felt to be put in the special class and be teased. And it wasn't like that was the end of the problem, but there were times from that gaze on when she talked more than she had ever talked to me before. And I'm just wondering if there's I'm so interested in that moment, and I wonder if there's any relationship between the two that you can shed some light on.
Hmm. Well, in very Jan fashion, does anybody else have any ideas before I have a few thoughts, but does anybody else?
I think so. Lacan was very interested in the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, and he was particularly interested in this notion of the signifier, meaning the letters, the word CAT for cat to describe cat, and the signified, which was the animal itself, the animal as such, the cat itself, which Lacan would see as being in the real, the flesh and blood cat being in the wilderness. And studying language, Lacan recognized that the signifier CAT for cat would never ever come close to capturing the realness of the animal. That your experience of seeing the cat run around, jump around, play with you, petting it, none of that could be captured in this word, right? This word was such a compromise of the realness of the experience of the animal. And so just by coming into the symbolic order of language, the very first time a child hears the word no by father, there's the experience of lack. Of course, when you're hungry as an infant, not having mom to comfort you when she's in the other room, there's lack there. But lack is really, really understood the moment you come into language. And so it's difficult for me, Bonnie, to consider how the imaginary, the image of mother's face or one's own face in the mirror elicits lack, other than it's the not me of me. You know, when your patient, or when I stare into the mirror, I'm looking at me, but it's not me, right? So there's a lack there. When the patient stares at you and you're mirroring an emotional reaction on your face and in the patient's face. Oh, okay. I don't know what someone's shitting about, but anyway, I think that even though there's comfort in that imaginary, the analyst's face mirroring the emotional reaction of the patient, that there's still a lack there. But this is the final thing I want to say, because this is what I raised my hand about earlier. And hopefully, Bonnie, this connects with your story about your patient. But the last thing I wanted to say was, Jan, I think, was optimistic in putting more and more words to things, even though he had a Lacanian understanding that the word would never capture fully the experience. There would always be a shortcoming there. I think, and I'd like to use the analogy, I don't know if I've ever heard him use this analogy, but maybe it works. I like to think of the words being like legs on a table. If you had a two-legged table, that table is not very stable, right? It might hold up. The person's psyche might hold up. Their identity might hold up briefly, but it's tenuous, you know, it's a little weak. As we put more and more words to capture these experiences as best we could, I kind of picture it as adding legs to the table. The table becomes more and more sturdy. You can never have legs to fill up every single space. There will always be an empty space there, right? Even if you're looking at the quantum mechanic microscopic level, you can never have enough support there that every empty space is filled. But kind of just to make my last comment and to refer back to termination, maybe that's perhaps why Jan didn't believe in termination in many cases was because you can always add more words to this empty space to provide more and more support for that table. That's all I'll say.
That really makes sense to me, what you're saying, Adam. And it also brings to mind the idea of optimal frustration. If that moment at the screen, Bonnie, was where there was something, but not everything. And the words are needed as a way to bridge the frustration of something, but not everything.
Mm.
Well, the bridge is, I think that's an important idea because the lack is the necessary condition for desire. That's where desire comes out of, is the lack. And for some people, there has to be enough silence for the desire to speak to arise. And kind of like, you know, a spark plug, you have to have the gap in the current has to be sufficiently far enough to where it wants to reach over, it wants to create that bridge. And I'm just, the picture of your patient kind of coming towards you on the screen, to me, it's like that spark in the spark plug, just bridging the gap. And like it was primed with the lack, and then it was ready.
Mm. And your thoughts about frustration are really important. She was the person that said to me every single week, next week in the office, right?
But Bonnie, I had a reaction. I don't have an answer to your question, but the way in which this patient moved close to the screen, my reaction was, it was as if, you know, when you're holding a baby and they're looking at you and they're really taking you all in. And my reaction was that she was, in taking you in, by getting, because you can't get that close when you're in the office.
No,
But
you're right.
but when she was that close to you, I had the association that maybe she saw you and felt some trust in your face, and that opened the opportunity for her to be able to talk to you, because you became more of a safe object for her. So that was, I would say that was an induced feeling that I had just hearing that description.
Well, that's very perceptive, Helene, because I felt very much like I was being looked at by a baby, and I felt as though I needed to show her as much as I could just with my face.
Mm.
You know, words are interesting in that they can both fracture experience and consolidate experience.
Mm.
And every word we use is a symbol or a signifier or a sign. It points to something that exists with or without words, especially issues of the ineffable. I think a lot of what we do with our patients is quite simply nonverbal. We hold a space that is safe and reliable. I remember early in my career when I abided by certain rules that I had set. One of my rules was I would never be the first to speak in a session. I didn't want to lead the patient one way or the other. And after all, a week had gone by and maybe new things happened in their lives. Patient came in to see me. We'd been working together for about 3 months. And he sat down. As usual, I non-verbally invited him to speak, you know, just kind of gesturing. He smiled at me, looked up at the ceiling, looked down at the floor, occasionally at me. Several minutes went by, total silence. And I settled in, as did he, into the quiet space. 50 minutes went by, not a single word was spoken. He then got up, extended his hand as he always did for a handshake, He thanked me and he left. Very next hour, I had supervision. And I said to my supervisor, I have nothing to report. My patient didn't say a word, nothing happened. And my brilliant supervisor said, don't be so sure. A week went by, the patient returned. First 5 minutes were exactly as they were the week before. Silence, looking up at the ceiling, checking in with me occasionally, smiling, but nothing was said. And then he looked directly at me and said, I want to tell you why I really came into therapy. He had been working for 3 months on sort of a vocational issue. He was a minister. His father was a minister. Grandfather was a minister. And he felt that this was his calling, and yet was ambivalent about it, whether he was being called by his father and grandfather or a larger force was at work. So we were talking about that for 3 months. And now, after that hour of silence, we began talking about something else, a secret that he had, that he was ashamed of. He then said to me, the reason I can tell you this now is that I trust you. Last week, you didn't push me or pull me. You simply abided with me. And I think Jan was the perfect example of a therapist who was willing, he wasn't in a rush, was willing to abide not only with his patients, but with his friends, to sit and listen and demonstrate his, as Helene was just talking about, that it's safe being with me. I'm trustworthy. He didn't use words to say that because, you know, this lies all the time. But he demonstrated that he was safe and trustworthy. And apparently in that 1 hour, I did it with this patient. And I think Bonnie, likewise, allowing the silence. A lot is going on during the silence, evidently.
Thank you all.
I can't connect.
Very nice.
You might want to check your connections.
Oh, is my connection off?
It's on.
Okay. So I wanted to, Phyllis, are you prepared?
I hope so.
Excellent.
I'm ready to say a few words about you, Phyllis.
Thank you, Bonnie.
So Phyllis is another CCMPS faculty member, and she's had a varied and interesting career. She's a New York State licensed psychoanalyst and a graduate of the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies. She's also a graduate of Cornell and Columbia University. She began her career as a grade school teacher and later became a reading teacher. And apparently she was still looking for new challenges, so she later became a school psychologist. But mother, grandma, great-grandma are perhaps the most rewarding roles she has filled. Quoting her directly, she says, I have always been interested in what makes people tick, in hearing what a person knows about themselves and helping people to discover more. In other words, inquisitive knowledge can be very useful. She will speak to us today about loss, specifically the loss of an analyst and the loss of a husband.
I have been in psychoanalysis for almost 50 years. Legend says that you can be in psychoanalysis, which is emotional education, for your whole life. And that legend also says that if a parent of children, you're in psychoanalysis, your kids will benefit from your psychoanalysis. So these legends have affected me. 8 years ago, though, my first psychoanalyst died. Over the years, he had canceled appointments, sometimes for several weeks. at a time, and we didn't talk about it. I never asked him why. And then one night, I attended the musical play Les Mis. At the end of the play, the old man dies. And I started to cry, not just with little tears, really crying. And it dawned on me, the old man died. So I was worried. I was worried about him. So he told me about his physical problems. But one day, we were talking about his physical problems and the measures to keep him alive, which in the past had calmed me down. But this day, he died. Tuesday, actually. I was speaking to him on Thursday and he died on Tuesday after a medical procedure. He had a funeral and I spoke at his funeral. A lot of people did. Unfortunately, the place was so small that some people didn't get their chances. But I thanked him. I thanked him for helping me, for helping me become more assertive, for helping me understand things about myself that I never would have known, particularly about anger. And my anger fantasies were amazing. Nobody who knew me could believe that I could have fantasies like that. For instance, once I tied him and my mother up. I threw them into the East River with a rock. Fortunately, didn't happen. And I was the kind of person who never would do anything like that. But I did feel my anger and get relief. And I get relief. So when I was at his funeral, I spotted a person who had been an analytic supervisor of mine. And I asked him to be my next analyst. And he was. And after he died, several times I had visions of him. One vision was going into a garage. I don't know why I had that, but my other vision was in a room with a huge mirror. And in that mirror, looking at me, was my mother and my father and my shrink. And my shrink said, "We did a good job." So I feel good about that. And I think he did a good job. And I just continued with my new shrink, figuring out my feelings about the old one and going on with my life. Now, before I go into the talk about my husband, I want to say that I have another story about a different analyst who was very, very sick. She was a group analyst. And at the last session that I saw her, she was in a wheelchair. She was that sick. And she asked us what our reactions were about working with her. And a lot of people said a lot of nice things. And I said some nice things. And she said to me, "But what about the not nice things?" And my school that I was connected with, my psychoanalytic school, had had difficulties with her psychoanalytic school. And I told her I was furious with her. I felt that she was being unfair. And I was very happy that she asked me about it. And when I think about that, I feel good. I feel good. It was worth saying. And she did die soon after that. So that's the story about my analyst. It was okay. It was okay. And I still think about him with pleasure. But 8 years ago, my husband died. We had a wonderful marriage. And I want to read a letter describing that marriage that my husband wrote to me. He said, "My dearest Phyllis, I love you very much. I might not say it often enough, but I love you every minute of every day. I have lived a perfect life, each day full of love and laughter. I could not have done all that we have done without you. What few challenges we encountered, we faced together and came through unharmed. As a team, we were able to accomplish miracles. Together, we raised 4 beautiful children, each perfect and remarkable in her own way. Our 8 grandchildren have been a joy, and somehow we have made a lasting, loving relationship with each one. Liam, of course, that was the great-grandchild, is the extra bonus that illuminates the world. Together, we have visited much of the civilized world. We have seen some of the world's great artworks and have enjoyed theater, opera, and dance together. Each of us has achieved success and respect in the way we have chosen to serve others and improve their lives. All in all, we have lived the dream we had when we were married. I could not have done it without you. We have a date in June 2027. Let's keep it. All of it was true, except we can't keep that date. At least we can't keep that date in person. Well, can any one of us react to losing out on such a beautiful relationship? I was knocked for a loop. Last week in the New York Times, it was described how somebody went so crazy, she had to go into an insane asylum that was right across the street. However, she probably was not analyzed. The analysis really does help. My reaction to Lee's death was not so dramatic. After all, I was analyzed. But I felt like my mind was fuzzy, as if I were going through the notions of responsibility in a daze. The only time that I felt myself, that my mind was normal, was when I was working as a psychoanalyst. I wonder if that was because I was intellectually and emotionally in a state of involvement with someone else, but I really don't know why. But I really thought about missing Lee. I constantly felt insecure about living my life without him, without someone who made me feel important, who so helped me feel happy, who helped me feel capable, who felt me feel loved. And I still think of him 1,000,000 times a day, or maybe 500,000 times a day. Sometimes the feelings are good. Sometimes I feel lousy. But I accomplished my life. I had kids who helped me with the stupid legal things that had to be done. And they helped me move to Colorado and helped me live here. I'm meeting new friends, taking care of chores. My mail is still a big mess, but I am doing it. And I miss him. And I miss his love. And I miss everything about what we had in our life. But in between for these longings, there are periods of pleasure and feeling happy. And in the beginning, I was thinking about when I might die. But now I'm looking forward to at least 10 more years of experiences that he has to miss, but I can do.
What was the date of 2027?
When he died?
No, you said that he said in the letter that you have a date in 2027. What that date was going to mark?
Oh, we graduated from college together and we were going to go to my 75th reunion. And I had a plan, which maybe I shouldn't tell you, but I thought that after the graduation, we should go home and we should have sex and maybe we would die. But since we were so old, we would have to run around the house first so that our hearts wouldn't be able to live that much longer. That was the date.
Phyllis, you're awesome.
That's great. That's great.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what that day in 2027 entails. But I hope to go to the graduation.
Please let us know.
Okay.
How long were you married, Phyllis?
61 years. And I never lived alone until now.
Oh.
I lived with my parents. I went to college. I got married. And also one of my thoughts were that until I met him, I wasn't as happy. And I met him and was happier. And then we got engaged and I was happier. And then we got married and I was happier. And then I had one child and my happiness increased. 2 children, it increased. 3 children, it increased. 4 children, it increased. And then grandchildren, it increased. Now I have those happinesses, but I also have missing Lee as a sadness. We were lucky.
Was your husband an analyst or in analysis as well? Or was
No, he's
you?
not.
No.
He was a lawyer, and he did not go into analysis, although he recommended analysis for many people. But
well, he had you.
That's right. That's right. And as I said, when I started, if somebody is in analysis, supposedly it helps the whole family, even if it's only one person. And off and on, my kids have been in treatment, but none of them have had an almost 50-year analysis.
If I may say, there's another thing that I hear from Phyllis is a wonderful tale. She beat me by a number of years. I was only married to my wife for 53 years, but I knew her for 60 because we met when I was 15 and she was 13.
Oh boy.
So that was a long time together. And the point I wanted to say and share is the multiple ways of grieving. I don't believe, as Phyllis has said, that a day goes by that I'm not talking to my wife or thinking about my wife or discussing things in my mind with my wife. But I'm also feeling a pleasure that she didn't have any service with COVID. She died before the COVID world came about, which I think would have caused her death if she hadn't died of something else prior to that. But this idea of a grieving is a finite period, I think, is what Phyllis and I are sharing with you folks, that it may not be a finite period. It may go on in different degrees and different intensities as long as you have thoughts and the love for that person.
And feel so fortunate that they're in us. They are.
Phyllis, what you said was very beautiful. And David reminded me of Jan also, I think in many different areas, emphasized the incompleteness of things. I recall in my training at the university internship that we have to do, the practicum, I got into a huge argument with an instructor who was the co-instructor because she thought it was very important that I have a beginning, middle, and end to the session. And that I did not summarize what the patient had said at the end and give some kind of false sense of finality to the session, some false sense of closure, when life is not that way, right? And Jan really helped me articulate this. I had a good argument for her, and because I had been in analysis with Jan and in classes with Jan, and I defended myself. And I always kind of was annoyed by, but also comforted by Jan's insistence on the time, the framework of the time of the session, which he adhered to quite strictly. And so, you know, I might be in the midst of something very intense, and before I knew it, and we're out of time for today. And suddenly I'm cut off, you know. But I would say, okay, you know, all right, fine. And that, I guess, in the way that other people were talking about termination, that was my practice, you know, that was a kind of practicing of that feeling, that I didn't get to finish everything I wanted to say because we were out of time. But I had a sort of begrudging, I came to really like it. I don't know why, I can't really say, but that incompleteness, he taught me that through the framework of the session time, and having to cut me off sometimes and say, we're out of time for today. There was no summary, there was no false sense of closure. But I'm glad that he did it that way.
Phyllis, you expressed sort of a sense of wonder that after your husband passed away, you were in something of a fog, but then you began to work and things cleared up. And that makes sense to me in two ways. There's nothing more effective to clear the mind than to focus our attentions on the need of another person, to mobilize our energies in behalf of someone else. The second thing that came to mind is something that Francis of Assisi said: it is in giving that we receive. And he's not talking about some Western notion of karma, that if we do a good deed, eventually it comes back to us. He was saying something far more radical. It is in giving that we receive, in that moment. So how can that be unless you and I, as you're listening to me now, are part of the same thing? You and the patient are part of the same thing. You're connected. So in giving the attention and the care to a patient, you are receiving it because you're connected. Even now, with Jan gone, he has slipped out of form, no longer exists in space or time, which are dimensions that we conceive of as separating us. And we conceive of death as separating us from the other. But in fact, the very same space and time connect us. Requires maybe tilting our head a little bit to see it in that way. So one final comment. All during the day today, I feel Jan's gentle presence. He's here. He's amongst us. He resides here. He resides between us. He resides around us. He resides in the past. He resides clearly in the present, and he resides also in the future, no longer bound as we are.
Oh. I'd like to just jump in quickly and link this to what Vic was saying with concept, that care circuit, that we are in this together, whether we are giving or receiving.
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody, thank you, Phyllis. So wonderful to hear you talk.
Thank you.
I would like to copy you, Reed, and read a short poem that just keeps coming to mind today, but particularly because of what Phyllis has just said. It's a poem by Grace Paley, and it was in a collection of poems that was put together near the end of her life. And it's called Walking in the Woods. That's when I saw the old maple, a couple of its thick arms cracked, one arm reclining half rotted into earth, black with the delicious hospitality of rot to the littlest creatures. The tree, not really dying, living less widely, green head high above the other leaf-crowded trees, a terrible stretch to sun to just stay alive. But if you've liked life, you do it.
So, Kathy, are the flies going to let you leave you alone for a little bit? You'll have to unmute.
Let me just say a word or two about Kathy.
Yeah.
She was born in a small town in northern Vermont, and I didn't know that until we got ready to do this conference. She grew up in a family that was drawn to help people from every walk of life. She moved to California to go to grad school and planning to move back to cold weather when she finished, but that never happened. She has suffered from horse fever since birth and now uses horses and dogs to do therapeutic work. She teaches full-time at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology in LA, and she has a full-time private practice. In addition, she helps to care for 3 developmentally disabled adults that her parents raised from childhood. She'll be opening an equine therapy practice this month. She sounds like a pretty busy woman. She's a faculty member at CCMPS, and she's going to talk about her work with Jan and the book that resulted from that work.
All right, well, I just want to, I'm wondering if Jan is coming here in the fly to bug me so I can get over my nervousness, because first of all, I have to say this is the first time I've ever been willing to do any kind of a talk, because it makes me so nervous. And it makes me especially nervous with the Colorado Center because the students here are just brilliant, like Jan. And so having sat in classes and having mentored with, I mean, Jan being my mentor and gone through classes and everything else, I never thought, well, what am I going to teach students at CCMPS that Jan hasn't already taught them? So I never really wanted to give a presentation of any kind. And every time I would go to do it, I'd get nervous just like I am now. So the fly is kind of calming me down. So this could be Jan visiting me to calm me down so I can tell you my story. As I put in the thing that Bonnie mentioned, I was born in a small town in northern Vermont. I did suffer from horse fever from birth. I was raised on a farm. My parents were into helping the community and the helping professions. And my mother worked for a private boys' school for delinquent boys from New York City who had murdered and done terrible things, and they brought them up to Vermont rather than put them in jail. And so I got to interact with lots of troubled people. And then my mother decided to take on being a foster mother to emotionally disturbed children. I don't know if you know what that's like, but living with emotionally disturbed children is a big challenge. And of course, so we did that for many years, and then they moved over to working with developmentally disabled special needs children and took care of them. That inspired me to go and study psychology. And I started out in Vermont, got my bachelor's degree at a school in Vermont. Then I came out to California, saw the weather, and decided I wanted to come out here to go to graduate school. So I went all the way through graduate school, graduated in 87, did my dissertation. I'd studied spiritual psychology. I went all the way through graduate school, never took a psychoanalytic course ever. In fact, I had a bit of an allergy toward Freud because I had just had the idea he was a dirty old man and only thought about sex. Of course, I was kind of off there, but that's what I thought. And so then I had a chance to voluntarily go into a modern psychoanalytic introductory course at the graduate school where I was interning. And Dr. Arlene Alvarez was teaching. I don't know those of you who know her, or maybe you don't, but she was in New York and she studied at the Manhattan Center, and then she moved to California and she stayed there. And it was the best course I've ever taken in my life. And I fell in love with modern analysis. And so it actually, what turns out, it wasn't modern analysis I fell in love with. It was really the professors who lived modern analysis. I guess that's what it was, because I had always needed help, and I was always looking for people who would give me the feeling that there was hope. I could get stronger. I could have a life. I could have self-esteem, and so on and so forth. And so anyway, so I traveled across the country to go to New York to meet, not New York, to Boston to meet Phyllis Meadow, Dr. Meadow. My dad went with me. We went into her house. She was gracious. She said, yes, I'll come to California and I'll start a psychoanalytic institute. I found out afterwards that she was kind of impressed that my dad and I drove through a snowstorm to come visit her, and she was sick. And anyway, that's kind of a long story of how I got into modern psychoanalysis in the first place. Then after 2 years of wrangling between analysts and the breaking up of what was the California School of Modern Psychoanalytic Studies, we joined with CCMPS. That's where I met Jan, and that's where I met Robert Marshall, and that's where it all began. And I would say Jan was one of my favorite mentors. He taught me a lot. He just lived the theory, and it made a believer out of me. So I had been studying it for years, and then I had a chance to go back to the school where I graduated and teach. And so I decided to teach Introduction to Modern Psychoanalysis. I guess this is where I think Jan has contributed to, because everything I learned from him and the few other analysts I mentioned, to allow me to take it outside of the psychoanalytic community to the field of psychology, where many people don't know about psychoanalysis and actually have a very negative attitude toward it because they think this or they think that. And so I taught this course and got very positive feedback from the students, and it turned them around in terms of, they said, oh, I never knew this theory was like this. And they'd say why they didn't like it, and so on and so forth. And so anyway, that brings me up to spending 7 years to work on this book I published. It's called Personal Investments, Investing in Your Self-Worth. It's a practical guide on how to use psychotherapy as an investment in your life. So I took all the things I learned from modern analysis and put it in the book. And the interest I had was to educate patient populations, or the lay population, about how the mind works, how psychodynamic psychotherapy, modern psychoanalysis works, and how it really functions to do good for people. And if they really knew how it worked practically, not the myths of therapy, then it would have the ability to benefit everybody, even though everybody wouldn't necessarily come to therapy or go to therapy. And so there's certain principles that I covered. So I thought I would just take a little bit of time and tell you what I teach my students in psychology and what I put in the book, so that patients can read the book and hopefully use it to make a better experience, have a better experience of therapy. Most importantly, to give it a chance to work, because as we know, we're studying resistances, we're working with transference, and many times a patient will have this treatment destructive resistance, and when it gets tough and it's really time to work on something to get ahead, they get scared and they have an id impulse to leave and they prematurely terminate. And so I had learned from my classes and so on, different things, ways that I could use emotional communication to see if I could help patients to get through those tough times, so they could become a stronger person, so they could emotionally mature, by focusing more on emotional development and helping people to understand how they go through stages of emotional development. And if they don't get their emotional needs met, then that can be a problem from them. Using it in kind of their language, not the sophisticated language that we learn in graduate school. So anyway, yeah, so those are some of the concepts. I'll tell you what some of the ideas were that I taught in my classes, and it resonated with the students. And now we may be getting many of our students from the Chicago school who are interested in getting analytic training here with the Colorado Center, just because they think it's very, it made sense to them. It made sense how it works, and it made sense how they could apply the principles and the interventions to work with clients. So anyway, some of the philosophy of it is that patients are driven to grow. I mean, we talk about the drive theory, the libidinal drive. I guess I translated the drive theory that Freud talked about to patients are driven to grow. That's the libidinal drive. And then the death drive is the death is a need to return to a state of no pain. Not that people want to kill themselves, but if they're in too much pain, then they will do destructive things because they want to end the pain they're going through, which is death. I also talked to them about the idea that relationships heal, and that in modern psychoanalysis, the focus is on the relationship. That's what you have. You don't have a bunch of interventions. You have two people who get together. The analyst plays a role. I talked to them about the role that the analyst plays. I talked to them about the crazy making role that the analyst plays, because you're expected to attach to your patients, and at the same time, you're expected to not attach to your patients. So I made a list of different things that were kind of crazy making. I thought, because I thought it would be a setup for a therapist who has an understanding. If you're going to do psychodynamic work and you're going to work with their unconscious, then it would provide them some things that they could think about. Let me see, what else did I put down here for? So you're expected to be important and not important. If you get into the role of the analyst, you do have to do transference. Well, you don't have to, but you will do transference work. You'll allow your patients to project onto you. That's where they have the chance where they can do it and you don't reject them. And there's stability in the relationship. You're expected to know everything, and at the same time, you're expected to know nothing. So these are all things that are a little bit crazy making if you think about it. You're supposed to be professional at all times and personal at all times. So anyway, I talked to them about the role of the analyst to create an environment that invites all feelings, so that we basically can be a model for what we're asking the patient to do. We have the patient come in, we ask them to say everything, then we have to be willing to hear everything. So if your philosophy as the therapist or the analyst is all feelings, you create an environment that invites all feelings, then you're going to be not a hypocrite. You're going to hear everything, and you're truly going to help them to resolve their resistance to talking about everything. Emotional maturity is custom. It really is. So you have to train therapists that not to expect every patient is going to be alike in terms of how fast they're going to go through their emotional development and mature and grow. So I think modern psychoanalysis puts a positive spin on human nature. And I think that's what we work with in modern psychoanalysis. We look for the redeeming need for resistance instead of asking patients or asking therapists to get rid of resistances or not to work with them or avoid them. We look to see why do they need to hang on to a resistance, and we don't take it away from them. And it's kind of like letting them mature at their speed, letting them grow at their speed. What else? Yeah, I would say that the other thing that I talk about in my book and in my classes is the idea that when you're going to go into therapy, you're looking to help a patient to develop a relationship with themselves. That is to say, learn how to develop a tolerance for all of their feelings, know how to handle feelings that are hard to deal with or whatever feelings comes their way, and then become a stronger person and move through developmental needs to get emotional needs and developmental needs met. Because that's what it's all about. If people have needs, emotional needs that aren't met, they're going to be depressed, they're going to be unhappy, they're going to have psychological problems of all kinds. And they're not going to get to the developmental stage where they have a purpose in life. And so I think this is a well-rounded analysis, not just a quick fix, not just cognitive behavioral therapy, but is using a relationship like the relationship all of Jan's patients have with him, or every therapist has with their patients, to help them, to watch them to grow. You're reparenting them, you're helping them to separate and individuate and build a sense of self. So I don't know, I'm rambling on here, and I know this is probably stuff you guys have all heard before, but I was looking to tell it to you in a context of how you would take students or people who aren't in the field and tell it to them in a way that is more easy to comprehend, so that they could get the benefit that analysis offers, and not just have it be a short-term therapy when they need to emotionally mature. So I'm going to tell you just a couple of the chapters that I covered in the book. I talked about the human being, just about what the human nature, about human nature, instincts and intuition, how people can use them, the myths of therapy, outgrowing a victim identity, resentment, a prison sentence for the self, poverty consciousness, being your best self, self-worth, how are you using your energy? I also mentioned to them about the idea of how everything is personal at a certain level. When you're insecure, anytime anybody says something to you, everything is taken personally, and how to step back and be able to get some distance from emotion so everything doesn't become personal. And what else? And then also the impersonal mind, the idea that everybody has an impersonal mind, and that isn't the negative voice, judgmental voice in our heads that have thoughts come to us. None of us ask for them, and they come, and then they get under our skin, and then they do harm to our day, whatever it is. And that if people can just understand it's not personal, it is impersonal, everybody has it, everybody goes through it, it is a common denominator. I would say the last thing I want to say before I finish up this is that this is what helped me and what I love the most, because I used to treat eating disorders using spiritual psychology. I wrote my dissertation on treatment for eating disorders using this psychosynthesis. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that theory, but it's been around since the days of Freud, and it's a spiritual approach. The idea everybody has a higher self and a lower self and a middle self. And anyway, I did this study and I got positive results from, I did a true experiment. I did a three research groups, got a final result, went out and started treating eating disorders. And then all of my patients would get to a certain point in therapy and they'd all quit before the therapy could help them. And I was using spirituality and everything else. And what I realized is I didn't know how to help patients to deal with their anger, with their negative emotions. And so when it came time to deal with the hard stuff that nobody wants to deal with, patients will leave before they'll talk about it, because they're going to test you to see, well, if I'm not so nice, or if I'm negative, if I'm angry, what are you going to do with me? Are you going to reject me? Are you going to withdraw? Or are you going to embrace me and give me permission to be the whole person that I am? And so I think that's one of the gifts modern psychoanalysis offers that to the field of using interventions and emotional communication to help patients to be able to direct their aggression outward instead of inward. And Spotnitz did a study back when he was in the mental hospital, where he helped patients to get angry at him and to use words to express it, and their symptoms decreased. And it kind of made sense, because we all hold our own negativity in at our own expense, because we're afraid if we let it out, somebody's going to leave us, somebody's going to reject us. So that's kind of a repeating of the same thing. But I just have used this now. It's been hard for me because not Spotnitz. Spotnitz is really good with the aggression. I'm not. But I've gotten through. I've helped a lot of patients just because I was able to rise to the occasion, because I saw the value of it, of having a whole relationship, and using things like emotional communication to help patients to get angry at me. So anyway, that's it.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's really we were talking earlier about the Colorado school and the emphasis on being able to speak a lot of different languages, being able to speak the languages, the language in Montana, the language out in California, the language in New York, the language of whoever we're working with. I think your book and your work really show another way of doing that, how to talk to psychology students about psychoanalytic concepts, so they don't, before they form their judgments in concrete.
They're premature judgments. Yeah, and a lot of them have. So it got me a successful career at the Chicago School, because I am one of the favorite teachers there. I'm not bragging about it, but they love modern psychoanalysis. And so they keep coming back to taking my classes. And, so I figure I'm spreading Jan's work outside into the field, and that he really did have an impact on me, even though he wasn't, I did do some supervision, but he wasn't my analyst. He was my friend, as Lean is. And I miss him terribly, terribly.
Kathy, that's not Kohut's Chicago school, is it?
Kohut's?
Kohut? You're not talking about Kohut's Chicago school?
It's the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. It was in Chicago, and they bought out California Graduate Institute, and now they have campuses all over the country. So it is not a psychoanalytic school. We offer psychodynamic classes, and we're seeing if we can negotiate to bring some psychodynamic, because all the students lust for it and need it and feel like they don't get a good enough training without it. So yeah, I don't think it's Kohut per se, because nobody was doing psychoanalysis there of any kind. Cognitive behavioral therapy, and then I happen to study psychosynthesis.
Great. So in this final hour, I want to really thank everybody else, everybody for talking with us and sharing so openly. I wanted to see if we could all talk together with Helene's help and Lynn Irwin's help. We're hoping that Lynn will be teaching an ethics class in the fall to talk about the ethics. What's the responsibility of the institute? What are our responsibilities to colleagues when we know an analyst is ill, or when there's a sudden loss? And I just want to say two things. One is just to refer back to my father's neurologist asking whether or not we had our healthcare plans in place, and our DNRs and et cetera, and to think about what do we owe the people coming up after us, and what do we owe the students we're teaching, and what do we owe to our patients, to prepare them or to safeguard them should something happen to us. I also want to, there's a very interesting article by Alessandro Grella in Napoli on the ethics in the termination of analysis. And what Alessandro asks is where the question about, he believes that the termination is an ethical issue, and it depends where you locate the termination. Is the termination happening on the conscious level, or the unconscious level? So can there be, in the unconscious, can there be an end to treatment? And on the conscious level, but on the conscious level, it seems it would be irresponsible to believe that treatment could never end. First of all, all of us are gonna pass away at some point, and the idea that psychoanalysis can cure everything, I think, is probably an inherently unethical idea. So I just wanted to talk together, and Helene and Lynn and anybody else who has had a chance to think about this, about analytic wills, about what we owe to the patients, to our patients, to our students, and to the field as a whole. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you think we should do going forward. This is the beginning, I hope, of a longer conversation about this, that we in the whole field can examine and maybe come up with some ideas.
I wasn't going to say anything because I'm not a part of this institute in any way. I'm Phyllis Scoy.
Hi, Phyllis.
Hi, a close friend of Helene and Jan's. And I just want to say this is a wonderful step that the Institute has taken in presenting all of this. And I respect and really congratulate all of you for doing this. I was working in a place in New York where the director of mental health died, and everyone knew he died from AIDS. And there was no discussion, nothing happened. And I remember sitting in the psychiatrist's office and the two of us bemoaning the fact that we couldn't all get together and talk about how this had affected us in a constructive and meaningful way. It just went away. And I think that happens so much. And I give you all, every one of you, so much credit for doing this, because I think it's helped everyone who worked with Jan, who knew Jan. Even as a friend, this has been incredibly useful for me. So I just wanted to get that in there. I think this is an ethical step. This is a huge ethical step for all of you.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you for sharing that. There's a tremendous amount of, I don't know if denial is even the right word, about death, illness of an analyst and patients as well, but in particular about analysts in Psychoanalytic Institute. It's almost like a shameful topic that somehow it denotes a failure on some part. Because there is that myth somewhere that I've heard, it was told to me, it was not just something picking up, that if you're well analyzed, you live at least 120 years or. And then when that doesn't happen, something went wrong. Somebody did something wrong. Somebody was not analyzed fully correctly or something, or the analyst was not doing a good job. And that compounds this reluctance to accept death and see death as a part of life. I can tell many unfortunate stories, either from the patient's point of view or analysts, of how things can go wrong. And maybe, Claudia, you have some better stories to tell of how those things can be avoided, but I don't have a will. The whole concept is fairly new to me, for instance, psychoanalytic will, and it boggles my mind how one comes up with one, or what really entails, and how much would a patient of mine, if I were to die, would know or participate or not in the process of whatever follows afterwards, small or big. Anyway, I just want to say that.
You know, I think the model for it was Freud, who never wrote about his illness and worked until he was, through being incredibly sick, and we have nothing about it. And so in a way, I don't think it entered into psychoanalysis. It just appears and gets erased and appears and gets erased, and which is why it's so great what you did, because it's a way of not erasing what's happening. But as for analytic wills, I think they're essential, and I imagine that everyone has to figure out what's best for themselves. But that patients, I had 2 analysts die, and I never was told. The third one, I was in the institute and of course knew when he passed, but patients are left not even knowing that their analysts have gone, and that's the person who's supposed to protect you disappears, and you don't even know. It's terrible what happens.
I've been treating a patient for 32 years. She's a schizophrenic, and she's my longest standing patient. And every year, multiple times a year, she brings up what's going to happen when you die, what's going to happen to me. She's very dependent. She's as dependent today as she was 30 years ago. And I have continued to just join her and say to her, I'm doing the yawn thing. I'm going to be around forever. I don't plan to die. But now that we're having this discussion, and then this did happen when I caught COVID last year. And for a moment, I was having a little bit of problems breathing. And then with all of the propaganda out there, I thought, okay, within a day, I could be dead. And she's the first person I thought of when I thought I was going to die. The second was my family, but I was like, oh my God, I'm going to break my promise to her, because I actually did think I was going to die. It scared the hell out of me. I was okay, but yeah.
Kathy, while I did get the sense that Jan probably believed he would be around forever, I think that, at least in my sessions, his first response would have been to ask, what would it be like if I weren't here.
Mm.
That's kind of how I remember him. I did tell him about a dream once. I had a dream that he would pass away. This was probably at least a few years before it happened. And I had sort of imagined Beth was in the dream. I think I told Beth about this at one of Celeste's parties. That Jan was like a samurai in the dream. He was in a traditional kind of samurai garb and performing a ceremony with a katana blade to sort of knight, mixed metaphors, you know, Beth and I as the next leaders of CCMPS. And I kind of joked with him about this because I didn't then and do not feel currently anywhere near capable of filling those gigantic shoes, you know. And it's so funny to think about that dream now, because when he died, while I could have maybe stepped in and tried to help the school, I didn't. I ran, you know, I isolated. I didn't want to see or hear from anyone. Total opposite, you know, I maybe could have tried to take an administrative role. These are just immediate reactions I'm having to what you said. I don't have a point here, so I apologize to anyone that is wondering. Get to the point. What's the point?
You made a point.
Did Jan have a reaction on your dream? Oh, you said he was a samurai who was knighting you and Beth, but you said that in that dream he died. Is that?
Yeah, that he knew he was going to die, and he wanted Beth and
that's
I
why.
to sort of take over, and it was just in silence. It was all in ceremony. And I thought of it, I think, because I do recall him asking something like, what would it be like if I were to die? Or, you know, is that what you would want, or something like that? Just exploring. And I told him, yeah, I've fantasized about like having your job, taking over the school, publishing papers. At that time, I wanted to be such a big deal. I wanted to be like a rock star in psychoanalysis. I'm in a very, very different place now, but yeah, his reaction to that was to explore what it would be like for me.
I don't think it should surprise any of us when we tend to withdraw from the face of grief or death. In a culture that is in denial of these things. I remember as a boy growing up in a small town in Wisconsin, occasionally I would see a grown-up with a piece of black cloth on their left arm. And I remember asking my mom, why is he wearing that? And she's told me he's in mourning. And of course, as a child, you don't quite understand that, but you understand that it was a sign that man was giving to everyone that I'm in a certain place. Please take care, right? Nobody wears black crepe. Nobody reveals the secret burdens that they carry, except maybe in the rarefied hour of therapy or analysis. So anyway, I'm just kind of opening up the frame that what we go through and don't have estate plans and don't have DNRs and all of that. We're just behaving the way everybody behaves in our culture right now. And then we face the consequences of that.
Yeah, so what effort can we make or should we make towards changing the culture in
begins-
this regard?
I think it begins here and now. I mean, this is a whole day in which we're facing things that we're not allowed to talk about.
I'm a retired psychoanalyst, and there was a point when I did make a will, an analytic will, and I did it with two other people. We got together and I followed through. The other two people never did. But I had a list of my patients that was given to another therapist, that should anything, because I didn't want to leave it for my husband, who was going to inform these people. And this person had a key to my files, that should anything happen, that they would have charge, they would be left with files. I didn't want my files out there when I had very personal information on people. And so I did take that step, and it's a very difficult one because who do you designate? And who do you entrust with making these phone calls and making sure that people are taken care of? And but I think it's a very important step to take because, like with Jan couldn't have predicted this would happen, and no one can predict when it might happen.
Phyllis, you report something that I attended a conference, and it was all about wills. And Phyllis, you did some of the strategies that were identified, and I think that you can be very concrete in terms of discussing some of the strategies. You can also continue this discussion and address to the attendees what do they think would be viable to do. The things that I learned and were basically, having somebody you trust, and if something happens with that person, you have someone take over. But their keys were a very important part for your files. The other was your scheduling, to show the person who's taking over where your scheduling book it was, and to have a list of ongoing patients that you work with, and who need, so that you know who needs to be notified in the case of your demise. So it was and actually this whole workshop was done by a woman who was very funny, and she made it very light, and I think she made it, because it's such a heavy topic, and because you are dealing with something you don't want to deal with, your death. She raises the questions, like Phyllis said. I don't want to leave this to my husband. I want to make this. I want to put some closure on my practice in an ethical way. There are people that do workshops just and to identify exact the strategies that you can use, or the way that we do it is really to talk about what you can do, so people have a armamentarium of possibilities that they could utilize in their own practice.
First of all, it doesn't have to be done all at once. This can be done in stages. I had an experience where I came to my routine analyst's door, and there was a note on the door: "Won't be here today." Okay. I accepted that, went home. A week later, I went, and the analyst was there. And as you can imagine, every single patient that he had all day wanted to know why he wasn't there the week before, except me. I didn't ask. In my mind, well, he couldn't stand waiting for me to ask. So he finally asked why I didn't ask. So I said, I imagine you had an emergency. I imagine it's personal. I imagine it's none of my business. If it was, you'd tell me. And he mulled over that and wanted to know if it was, hostility and that I was going to withhold my concern for him and blah, blah, blah. And I said, it's none of my business. You want to tell me? Tell me. If you don't want to tell me, don't tell me. So about a week later, he told me he had a death in the family and he had to go to help the family deal with the death. But that's the first sort of lowest level. What if you're going to miss an appointment? What do you do? What's the ethical thing to do? The ethical thing to do is exactly what we want the patients to do. Give me a call and say, hey, I'm not going to be there. Don't waste your time. Okay. So I found somebody that I could rely on to, I just drew up a list by day. If I'm going to miss a Monday, here are the people I meet on Monday. Here's the times. Here's their phone numbers. We got a deal. You call. If I'm going to miss, you call. If you're going to miss, I call. Mutual. So it's not rocket science. Now, I wasn't planning on dying in the near future, so I really haven't made that second step, which is same thing. Schedule, phone numbers, and a message. And the easy message was, Dr. Irwin won't be here today. He's had an emergency. Or, Dr. Irwin won't be here today. Don't come. As much or as little as I want to have told. If I'm dead, then I wanted to add, well, he's dead. Here are some people that that he thinks are reliable and could take your case. And I would clear that with those people. And it's the same 3 people that I recommend to anybody when they say, hey, who's good? Well, there's Heidi and there's Doug and blah, blah, blah. And that's what you can do. And here are their numbers. Make it easy on them. And they also would be called and told, oh, by the way, old Irwin has kicked the bucket finally, and you may get some calls from his patients because you're on the list of referees. At what point do we stop accepting new patients? At what age? I've had a supervisor. Supervisor is different because it's sort of, there's a term, well, you're going to be my supervisor from now until January, and then we'll talk about it later. Because typically supervisors operate on a school schedule because they're faculty or they're associated with an institute or whatever. And sometimes you got the supervision for credit. For instance, in my state, supervision counts towards relicensing. So I'm on a schedule. I log all of my supervisions, who they're with, what's the date, how many hours, and then that goes to the state and they give me a license again. So there are a lot of little things. But, if you're 65, do you take a kid who's 12? If you're 75, do you take a kid who's 12? I just took a kid who's 12. Am I going to live to see her married happily? Hope so. But in the same way, we say, what's something we don't talk about? And we say, well, we never thought it would happen. It's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We just don't know when. That's the secret. So we have to prepare for it. And because we are in charge of the therapy, we are in charge of the analysis, we have to take the responsibility to protect the patient. So just as every marriage ends in death or divorce, every relationship with the therapist is going to end the same way. It's either going to be voluntary and successful, it's going to be voluntary and premature, shall I say, or it's going to be involuntary. Either way, We owe the patient our best. One of the things is, I haven't forgotten you. I've been planning for you.
Mhm.
And that's a kind and an ethical thing to do.
So if what we're talking about is what each one of us can do individually, but I wonder what it is as collectively we can do as an institute, for instance. What stance do we take as a group of people when somebody dies, one of us dies? What does the institute do other than basically stonewalling the patients, which and the students, which I have seen it firsthand happening. So, and information is one thing, but there is also the dimension of what kind of emotional involvement do we have in this process?
And I'd like to add to Giannis's question, should it be a regular part of the curriculum? Should it be an ongoing, should there be, it always be included in the class on ethics? Or as a regular aspect of supervision? Have you developed your analytic will yet? Have you thought about it? So what do we owe, what should we do, and what do we owe as an institute to our colleagues, our patients, and our students?
Those are good beginnings, but they don't help the patients. Should the patients be invited to mourn with us? Should Jan's patients be here today?
One of the things to consider, and I don't know what how this could be implemented, but for me, I think referrals are very important, especially helping to find the right person. And this would be a monumental task, but I don't see why an institute couldn't at least start to conceptualize of some way that the community, the psychoanalytic community at the institute, could assist patients finding the right person to be referred to. I don't know how that would work, but I can tell you that thanks to Jan, the work of psychoanalysis was always sacred. And when he passed, I just continued to observe the time for, I think, a couple of months. I can't recall for how long I did this, but I came in my office, I laid down on the couch, and I talked to him. I talked out loud as if he were there, and it really helped me. Eventually, something kicked in where it didn't feel the same, or I don't know, I guess I felt silly. I didn't want to say that, but at some point, after 8 or 9 or 12 or something of just being in here by myself, talking out loud to him, observing the same time that we would meet, Mondays at 4 p.m., Wednesdays at 4:15. And eventually knew that I had to find another analyst because Jan had instilled that in me. That was very important. I wasn't going to stop my psychoanalytic progress out of respect to him. And so it was very difficult to find somebody. I reached out to people in this community for some ideas. I started with one person who's not here today, that it didn't work out. It wasn't the right fit for me. But thankfully, going back to the community here, members of CCMPS, I did find an analyst that I feel very, very comfortable with. And that was a process that took some time. I think, close to a year to find the right person. So that's something I think, at least from my experience, at least beginning to think of a way that could happen. How do these analysts find someone else to work with that could work for them? I don't know what that process would be or how we would do that.
Agreed. You were mentioning about how does this become a part of the curriculum or some form or another. It seems like talking about the ideas of termination, and then all of these other, these subsequent ways of managing that are just as important. But it seems like when the topic of termination comes up, talking about death as part of the termination, and I don't think it's ever been talked about before in the topic of termination and treatment. So maybe that would be one very, very simple way to make sure that it's included.
And I'm sorry, just very quickly, a distinction between expected termination or death and unexpected.
I was going to say, I think it has to be part of curriculums. I mean, from the start. And I think that, I became an analyst when I was on the older side, but I think people in training, I think you change a way of doing things by changing the people who are being trained so that these things become second nature. Talking about creating analytic wills becomes part of the process that you learn just to do from the get-go, even if it is uncomfortable. Because I don't think it's rocket science creating an analytic will. I think that it's a form that no one wants to necessarily face or do, but you do it because your job is to care for your patient, pretty much above anything else. And if we don't teach students to do it, I don't think anything's going to change, because I think that the generations get stuck in the ways we've been doing things. And so I think it has to change just from the beginning. So it's natural from the get-go. And there are different ways to do it, but it's not hard to do an analytic will. There are forms that's written about, it's out there. It's something that just needs to be done. And I'm not saying it's not hard for we who have to create them. It is hard. But the actual process of it, if it's taught from the beginning, I think, it will change the institutes. And I do think institutes have a responsibility to their training, to candidates and to the candidates' patients to, implement a system that really requires it. But that's
one concrete thing I just thought of very quickly is I wonder if anyone would have an issue with letting patients know about the institutes that we are affiliated with, because we have a website, we have a number of other therapists that, there's some consensus about treatment there. So if patients know about the institutes we're affiliated with, they have some immediate options whenever they're ready.
I also think that in the curriculum, it seems to me that ethics, this would be an important ethical consideration and could be a part of the coursework. And it has a place. Everyone has to take ethics. And so students would be prepared and can think about this, and we can supply the kinds of forms that could be utilized. So we have a place for it.
Perhaps you organizers of this meeting can create a new generation of workshops for the graduates of your program who are out in the field and away from the center. And you also have the wonderful gift of being colleagues of each other. So you may be able to create these wills and sharing patients with each other, whereas people out in the community are doing their work by themselves. And so I think regular workshops on the nature of this concept seems like many people, not just in analytic circles, but in social work circles and maybe even a few of my colleagues in psychiatry would be interested in hearing more about these important topics that are shunned by all groups, not only analysts.
Mhm.
I think ethics is one place, yes, Helene, where this could be included, but I think it's a bigger issue as well and needs to be somewhere else in the curriculum in addition to ethics. I'm thinking of things like the death of a patient and how do we handle that, and how does an institute support an analyst who has a patient that died. So I think the whole issue of death is a larger issue that there's a lot more to explore and think about.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm.
Even
wanna-
to use the word death, even in our discussions today, the euphemisms, being reminded of the word death is always jarring, because we are continually using euphemisms because we're still afraid to say the person died, or we are mourning death, as opposed to this passing away phenomenon.
I agree with that comment
I don't want
very
to,
much.
well, Giannis, I don't want to forget your other question, which sounded to me like, should we be advocating with other institutes to talk about this, address it? You could be part of the student. But still, it makes a point. But I don't want to forget you. I think that you were asking about whether we should be advocating with other institutes that they also be thinking about this. Did I have that right?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
It
Did I go in and
froze,
out?
so I don't know if it was probably was my connection. So the last I heard about communicate with others, I think that would be, there is strength in numbers. There is more creativity in numbers. There are more ideas in numbers. So I think that would be wonderful. And also, I think Kenny wrote this culture of silence that exists around this topic. Often it turns into blaming, because I've heard it, blaming the person who died that they didn't do something right. It happens so often, whether it's an analytic candidate or it's an analyst or something. I think it would help a great deal to be part of other institutes who are willing to take a step in the direction of talking about death. In that way, I really agree with you, David, about not using euphemisms about death and dying. It's very hard, but I think necessary.
You just said something that reminded me of something, which is I think that, when an analyst dies and, patients don't feel cared for, we, of course, are only human and do the best we can in the face of our own illnesses and death. So, blame is tough for anyone. And I do think that institutes can do a better job of supporting people, their analysts, their community, when they get sick and are facing their own deaths. I don't have a brilliant, necessarily packed answer, but I think that, institutes have a job, which is to protect their members on either side, whether they're candidates or older, if they can. And maybe there's more we can do to help people grapple with what to do if you're facing illness and you're still working, and how to deal with logistics or, so many things. But I think institutes could play a bigger role in how to help many different people who are dealing with this.
I very much agree with you. Often I've seen other candidates talk about their analysts being old and not really being there for them. yet they feel that they have to stay and take care of the analyst. And often the institute kind of steps back, doesn't really participate in something. I think it's unethical that the load of this, the heavy load of this situation is really left up to the student or the patient somehow to figure out without getting any help from the institute, and only left kind of, it's between them and the analyst, or it's about the transference, or it's something else, and the institute not really taking an active role in that, which I think it's a mistake. I agree.
Christopher Bolus. Can people hear me here?
Yes.
Okay, so Christopher Bolus has a concept about the unthought known, which I think is very similar to the Lacanian real. It's kind of what someone would know, but it hasn't been put into words yet. And then he takes it a bit further and describes something he calls violent innocence, a way that parents can harm their children by denying that which the children know but don't know. And that there is a lot of harm that happens when we do not talk about, when we don't acknowledge that which everybody knows. Everybody knows that, every adult knows that people die. And if we don't talk about it, if we pretend like Freud did that it's not going to happen, or that the analyst is going to live forever, we are harming people. And that's, I think Lang also kind of goes into this with this concept of mystification and how really harmful it is when we participate in such a system. So.
One of the things that we've talked about here today, other than the death of an analyst, is the death of an institute, because there are members here today that have already gone through the death of an institute because its director or leader died. And I don't know how many of you saw what I wrote in the chat a moment ago, but Esther, since you did bring up the necessity of discussing the things that are known, but we're all reluctant to talk about. For years now, I've been worrying about CCMPS. Before Jan passed away, I was worried about CCMPS because I saw Justin and I in our 40s being the youngest members and everyone else being however much older. And I used to tell Jan, let's do something, a campaign, which I could have taken up on my own, I suppose. And at times would, using Facebook or social media, trying to bring people in. But my comment in the chat was simply that, this is something else that I think that we have to address. Rather than these individual analytic wills, or yeah, that's important too, but also thinking about the potential death of the institute, which affects, maybe more people. So this is very hard for me. I hope in the next decade or two that our school and other schools are able to bring in more young people, people fresh out of graduate school, people that are excited about psychoanalysis, and how do we foster that? Because if not, I think all of us are very aware of some of the stigmas that exist at the university level toward psychoanalysis, the decreasing availability of psychoanalysis, at least in the United States. So that's something I wanted to bring up and see what y'all's thoughts were. about that.
I'm with you, Adam. When I took my first course with CCMPS, there was a question, is this a living institute or a dying institute? How does it stand with the rest of the analytic community? And that was one of Jan's projects, to get everything lined up so that the training would be recognized on a broader scale. And I think I've addressed this with Helena too. Is this just for our personal growth, or is this something that is real and substantial? And it does impact who comes, who stays, and the future. So I don't know where CCMPS stands at this moment, but this feels like a good starting place.
Well, we certainly do need to attract more matriculated students. That is one of the primary jobs over the next couple of years. I have a vision of bringing all of the modern analytic institutes including ours to the same level, so that we can do something like what they do in Western Massachusetts, where they have a 5-college consortium. So you can take classes at any college, any of the 5 colleges. There's UMass, Amherst College, Mount Holyoke, Smith College, and Hampshire College. And you can take any classes at any of the universities and get credit for at your home university, 1-to-1 credit. And I talked with the head of ABAP about this, and that's a ways off in the future, but that's something that I would love to see. And the more relevant that we can make ourselves, I think the better chance we have, and the more exposure we have, we have a better chance to attract new students and new people to this field. And I think that this, the question of termination and of analytic wills is has to be well, it could be a very big selling point, for one thing, if we're doing it and nobody else is doing it. But if we can join together, we may be able to, if we're all together as a consortium, we may be able to advocate more strongly with the rest of the field. So
Rita, I think that it's also very popular in Philadelphia. All the Ivy League schools have united, and they have, any student can take courses in, different schools. But what I was thinking is that ABAP, being an accredited body, is so consumed with their goal or objective of accrediting institutes. I really think that it might be a grassroots, a kind of a way of organizing some other institutes, having a dialogue, starting that kind of relationship. I think that probably would, and through personal relationships, which is really how everything gets still done in these times. I think that would be a very good place to start, through who we know and through who they know, and begin to have some administrative discussions together. I think it's really a wonderful idea. It's very progressive, and it would bring in a lot of people to the school. And I think that one of the problems, we have been, up until recently, we have been a very unique school. And because of our uniqueness, we really haven't been a part of the fold, which we certainly can be now, being that we have courses online, and that it's more accepted now that people don't have to come into the office, and that you can have classes on Zoom and other ways now. This is all a very critical time for us to kind of push our way in, or not push our way in, or just to present ourselves.
Mhm. So I'm going to note that it was unique. During
Yes.
the last couple years, the other institutes have caught up and moved ahead.
Yes, that's right. And it was during those 2 years when COVID hit, and our school has really been facing some very difficult internal decisions.
Mhm.
But we're through that now. We're at a very different place.
So this is our survival is as an institute is a very important topic, and goes together with the death of individual practitioners. And I wonder if we can think about both at the same time. I think it might be a good idea for us, in a very easy early step, to have to increase the resources on our on the website, and to have a whole section on analytic wills, and become a place that people can go to as a resource to find out more information, and to make that public.
Sounds good.
It's a great idea.
I've actually had a few people touch base with me asking if I know of places that have training in this issue, and I don't. But there is a need for it, like how to grapple with these issues. So
I'm going to note just the things that have come up in the chat here. Broadening the idea from just psychoanalysis to psychotherapy. This institute doesn't necessarily have to totally recreate the wheel.
What do you mean?
Well, I don't want to speak for you, Esther, but I think, when I sent out invitations for this conference, it went to everybody, regardless of their background and their training. And so I think that you just have to keep doing that. It's important. Any therapist, mental health therapist, clinical social worker, anybody, any licensed mental health counselors. This is all important for everybody in the mental health field.
Yeah.
I want to say something about that very quickly, that I don't know how many other people found CCMPS before licensure, but Jan was very much of that belief, just like Freud, that anyone can become an analyst from any field, that everyone was welcome, that this was something available to everyone. I was a high school teacher that was interested in psychoanalysis, but did not have plans at the time to become an analyst, but I was invited to take classes. I audited a couple, and then Jan told me that I could simply start doing my logs and start getting credit. Boom, I'm a candidate. That was very attractive. I think if I had found the Institute and felt at any moment that there was a lot of rigidity in terms of who they expected to become a candidate, and any rigid idea about an ideology that they're supposed to be headed toward, I would have been turned off by that. What attracted me about CCMPS and Jan was the fact that I was a first year high school teacher that just simply had an interest in learning about psychoanalysis, and was very welcomed. And it wasn't just him, it was everyone. I went to that conference after a year of having studied at the school, and I met Vic and Beth and Celeste and everyone else, and they all welcomed me. I was in my early 30s, and had only studied psychoanalysis kind of on my own, and they all treated me like an equal. So I think if we can maintain that sensibility, that will attract other people. I agree. Psychotherapists of all kinds should be exposed to these ideas, and we should make them feel welcome, and we should make others feel welcome, whether they be teachers or firemen or whomever else is interested in learning about this stuff.
Whether it's psychotherapists or people like from your background or something similar, Adam. Schultz, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know how many people from El Paso have gotten in analytic training at institutes. I doubt that there are a whole lot of people from Grand Junction, Colorado that are studying at analytic or have any experience studying at analytic institutes. And I wonder, what the appeal is in common between places like that could help us deal with this question of, is this an institute that's dying or an institute that's growing?
Those are great questions. I hope we can all work together and figure out the answers to those. I am a very big advocate for community mental health, and that means we do the work where the people are, where you are and where the people are. It is the end of the day. I want to thank everybody so much for presenting and for asking questions and talking and coming on board for this difficult conversation. It's just I really hope it's just the beginning. It's just the first conversation of a longer one, and I hope we can have ongoing workshops about this and try and make some change in the field, have some impact of some sort. So if you have, if you're going for CEUs and you're working with the Canvas program, if you have any problems, just call me, send me an email. I will try and straighten them out as fast as I can. Those getting CEs from NAP, it'll come through them, so it'll take, so it'll I've got to send them information, and then they'll send stuff out, so it'll take a week or two. But if you want CEs, you've got to fill out an evaluation, and even if you don't want CEs, please fill out an evaluation so we know how to do this better next time.
Reed, thank you for everything you did to organize today.
I agree. Thank you, Reed.
Well, thanks too.
I want to say that too. Wow, you did a lot of work and wonderful work.
And I want to thank everybody for giving me fragments of Jan today. I really appreciate all the input that you gave me about him.